Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in accordance with the provisions of Standing Order 25-1, I, the Honorable Minister of District Administration, Tourism and Transport, seek leave in accordance with Standing Order 25-2 to move the following amendment to Private Member's Motion number 11, 2018-2019 as follows. Mr. Speaker, in the Resolve section, by deleting the word all before the words government development fees and substitute the words a more aggressive policy for tourism, small business development, including. Number 2, by deleting the word all before the words fees on tourist-related business. Mr. Speaker, for the sake of clarity, the Resolve section would now read, be it therefore resolved that the government considers a more aggressive policy for tourism small business development, including waiving government development fees, trade and business licensing fees, import duties, tourism-related fees for residents proposing such developments in the eastern districts of Boddentown, North Side, and East End, with a construction value of under $300,000, and farther waive fees on tourist-related businesses in the Eastern District which do not have gross revenues in excess of $300,000 per year. Thank you.
Honorable Member, I'm going to have to ask you to, since I have to read this in full, where you got down to the government considers a more aggressive, did you say policy?
Policy.
And what was the next word?
For tourism, small business development.
Small business development.
Including waiving government development fees.
Okay, I have the written one. I did not have the written one. No. Just so I understand, the one I have is the one moved by the member from East End. Is that the same as what the Minister of Tourism were reading? I'm going to send it to you, and then you just confirm that that's what it is. Honorable member, in regards to the amendment, proposed amendment, we have to take some more time with it, so I'll suspend proceedings for 5 minutes.
Well, the next motion is
House will be suspended for 5 minutes. Proceedings are resumed. The Deputy Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to propose an amendment to the private member's motion number 11, 2018. In accordance with provisions of Standing Order 25-1, I, the Honorable Minister of District Administration, Tourism and Transport, seek leave in accordance with Standing Order 25-2 to move the following amendment to private member's motion number 11/2018-2019 as follows. In the resolve section, by inserting the words, a more aggressive policy for tourism small business development, including before the word waiving. By deleting the word all before the words government development fees. By deleting the word residents and substituting the word Caymanians. By deleting the word all before the words fees on tourist-related business. Number 5, by deleting the figure of $300,000 wherever it appears and substitute the figure $500,000. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I have given the relevant permission under Standing Order 25-2, and therefore the proposed amendment would be therefore resolved that the government considers a more aggressive policy for tourism, small business development, including waiving government development fees, trade and business licensing fees, import duties, tourism-related fees for companies proposing such development in the eastern districts of Bordentown, North Side, and East End, with a construction value of under $500,000, and further waive fees and tourist-related business in the eastern districts which do not have gross revenues in excess of $500,000 per year. Is the Honorable Deputy Premier speaking to?
Just briefly, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I believe that the spirit of the motion, the private member's motion, has been understood and added to by the government. Mr. Speaker, I believe that one of the things that was made clear was that a more aggressive policy for the small entrepreneur that is just becoming involved in tourism is needed, and it's recognized from the motion that was brought. Mr. Speaker, the spirit is captured and considers a more aggressive policy, tourism small business, and after that there are references to different areas of fees that will be looked at during consideration. Mr. Speaker, I think that is the clarity of it. We changed where it was residents, and we put Caymanians to make sure that Caymanians would be the ones benefiting from this private member's motion and from the amendment that has been brought. So I think with those few comments, Mr. Speaker, the government's happy with moving the amendment.
If no other member proposes to speak, the member for Newlands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I will be extremely brief. I just wanted to rise to give full support to this amended motion and to thank the two movers, the member from Bordentown West and the member from East End, for bringing this. I think this is what we can all consider a renewed Go East initiative. And I especially want to thank the government for supporting it and for improving it. So with those few words, on behalf of the people of Newlands and the greater Bordentown, thank you.
The member for Georgetown Central.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll also be rather brief by saying that I congratulate the mover of this motion and the seconder and the government for working hand in hand together to create an initiative to help develop particularly small businesses that's dealing with tourism. I think this motion offers much opportunity for, like my good colleague from Newlands have said, in a renewed Go East initiative. I also want to highlight one other benefit that may come as a result of this if this motion does as it's spirited to do, which is potentially ease some of the traffic woes by creating more development in the eastern districts, so all businesses are not on the western districts. That being said, though, I must say, with my descendants of my family, origins being from Kimmenbrack, I'm a bit jealous that the eastern districts does not include Kimmenbrack, but I am aware that Kimmenbrack has a number of fees waived as it is, but they are a perfect district that would be included for such a benefit, because they too can offer that B&B kind of approach to what the spirit of this motion is trying to suggest. But that being said, Mr. Speaker, I want to say congratulations to the movers of this and the indication by all members to give full support, and I too give full support.
Glad to hear that, but don't forget the poor old speaker here. I take it we would have understood that we have agreed on the amendment. So I'm reading, we're going to have to take two votes. First, to agree on the proposed amendment. I'll read the proposed amendment again. Be therefore resolved that the government considers a more aggressive policy for tourism, small business development, including waiving government development fees, trade and business licensing fees, import duties, tourism-related fees for Caymanians proposing such developments in the eastern districts of Bordentown, Northside, and East End, with a construction value of under $500,000, and further waive fees on tourist-related businesses in the eastern districts which do not have gross revenues in excess of $500,000 per year. All those in favor of the proposed amendment? Those against? The ayes have it. The amendment passes, of course. As the motion is amended, does anyone propose to speak thereto? If not, then I'll call on the mover for his right of reply.
Mr. Speaker, I thank you, and it is only left for me to thank the government for their initiative to change this to a more aggressive and broader inclusion as it would be, and increase the amounts as well. I started at $500,000, but I was told that I was a little high, but the government, and I'm glad for that. I just want to say, Mr. Speaker, that the Minister of Health spoke of Health City, and that was one of the objectives of mine. People whose loved ones are in Health City from overseas, when they come, can rent these little small apartments if they're in East End, thus giving East Enders that opportunity, in Bordentown and Northside as well, within close proximity. And the other thing, Mr. Speaker, is I know that a friend of mine, boss, has bought up a lot of land right there in Breakers. Friend of mine and sometimes friend of mine, and a very good friend of the Premier's, sometimes friend of mine. And he is actively pursuing the possibility of building a big hotel there, and I want to support that. It is in Bordentown East, and I want to support that. I want the people to know that I'm supporting that. And then I look forward to hear what, I think it's the Dart Group or Dart Realty has bought the Barefoot Beach right on the border, East End, North Side. And I would like to see an not exclusive hotel, but a hotel, up-class hotel, like built there. So I'm hoping that pardon me? I'm hoping that's a possibility. People can do anything as long as it's done the proper manner. Keep that in your mind. And the other thing, Mr. Speaker, I should make it be known that, and declare my interest, that the minister spoke of eco-rides, and that is operated by my nephew. The eco-rides, a little business in East End, it's operated by my nephew. So I just wanted to make that declaration. So, Mr. Speaker, with that, again, I thank the government, and I thank all those who spoke and all those who will hope. I'm sure everybody's going to support this. What a meeting for me, eh? 2 times, 19 approval, 19 people vote for something that I brought here. I am going to pinch myself one of these days. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker and honorable members.
Question is, be it therefore resolved that the government considers a more aggressive policy for tourism, small business development, including waiving government development fees, trade and business licensing fees, import duty, tourism-related fees for Caymanians, proposing such developments in the eastern districts of Bordentown, Northside, and East End, with a construction value of under $500,000, and further waive fees on tourist-related businesses in the eastern districts which do not have gross revenues in excess of $500,000 per year. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against, the ayes have it. Private members' motion as amended, motion number 11, has therefore been passed. Next motion.
Private member motion number 12 of 2018-19, importation of personal transportation vehicles, to be moved the elected member for East End.
The elected member for East End.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in the interest of cooperation and not wanting to outshine some of these young men and young members of Parliament and steal their thunder, I beg leave to withdraw this motion in order that the member from Prospect can get his motion on the floor, and he is going to amend his motion to incorporate the spirit of mine. So, I don't know the spirit of whatever, but Mr. Speaker, I beg leave to withdraw this motion.
I'm sure that members will be is willing very much to cooperate with you. The question is that the private member's motion number 12 be withdrawn. All those in favor? Aye. Those against? Private member's motion number 12 stands withdrawn.
Private member motion number 14 of 18-19, motion to set standards for the importation of vehicles, to be moved with the elected member for Prospect.
The member from Prospect.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to move motion, private member's motion number 14, 2018-2019, standing in my name, entitled A Motion to Set Standards for the Importation of Vehicles, which, with your permission, Mr. Speaker, I will now read. Whereas the Cayman Islands has experienced an unprecedented rate at which vehicles are being imported, and whereas these imports continue to place significant pressure on the national roads infrastructure, resulting in heavy traffic congestion and increased wear and tear, with the demand for more roads with multiple lanes, further increasing the costs to the national budget, both in terms of infrastructure and human capital, while also placing increased pressure on the environment by way of excessive emissions. Be it therefore resolved that government consider examining and make recommendations on the most suitable standards regarding the importation of vehicles, such as by age limits, classification, and/or fuel type. And be it further resolved that government considers implementing a policy by the end of the fiscal year 2019 as a matter of urgency.
Seconder.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move to second the motion.
Question is that be it therefore resolved that government consider examining and making recommendations on the most suitable standards regarding the importation of vehicles such as by age limits, classification, and/or fuel type, and be it further resolved that government considers implementing a policy by the end of the fiscal year 2019 as a matter of urgency. The motion is open for debate. Honourable Member for Prospect.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yes, sir. Mr. Speaker, please permit me to begin by thanking the honourable member from East End for his spirit of cooperation in withdrawing his similar motion to make way for my own, and I certainly look forward to his contribution to this debate that may indeed follow. Mr. Speaker, in the modern world, it would be difficult to locate either a metropolitan city or advanced economy that does not have a traffic congestion problem. And the Cayman Islands are neither unique nor exempt from this phenomenon. And, Mr. Speaker, like most developed countries, the immediate response is to invest in improved road infrastructure in order to more reliably, safely, and efficiently transport goods, people, and valuable resources. But this is a costly solution, Mr. Speaker, and one that by its nature cannot be defined as a quick fix. When, for example, we consider how long it took for the Linford-Pearson highway expansion to be completed and the subsequent traffic delays it caused before things got better. Meanwhile, some, particularly those residents of the eastern districts, and perhaps those even closer to town, like my constituents in Prospect, might argue that building the Linford-Pearson highway expansion and the benefits thereof are still waiting to accrue. Mr. Speaker, an editorial was published by the Cayman Compass entitled "Cayman Cannot Pave Its Way Out of Traffic Jams," September 2017, and it described a country's roads as being likened to a body's circulatory system. They are a conduit that enables the free flow of critical resources instead of blood and nutrients, people and goods. It went on to state, Mr. Speaker, and I quote, "A well-designed, maintained, and functioning transportation system breathes life into every corner of the community, increasing livability and facilitating economic development." It went on to state, Mr. Speaker, an unfortunate side effect of Grand Cayman's great economic fortune is that as our population and household wealth have increased, so too has the amount of traffic, which at peak times overwhelms the capacity of our road network, despite continual improvements, expansions, and upgrades over the past several years, end quote. I think, Mr. Speaker, in our present circumstance, it is safe to say that this viewpoint does indeed have merit. And over a period of time, a whole series of words related to traffic congestion have gained currency to convey different degrees of the severity of the traffic congestion problem in Cayman. Words like rush hour, traffic jam, bumper to bumper, and of course my personal favorite, bottleneck, are but a few of the words being used to describe similar kinds of traffic scenarios that we experience here in Cayman. Vehicle overload, Mr. Speaker, on city roads have several adverse fallouts, and they include economic, environmental, personal, and mechanical. And with your permission, Mr. Speaker, I will expand on each of these briefly. Mr. Speaker, lesser mobility results in larger investment of time in commuting and unfavorably affects the output of the working individual, which also increases transportation costs of goods and services, which negatively influence both a city and an individual's economic productivity. The environmental costs, Mr. Speaker, is reflected in larger air and noise pollution on the account of greater use of horns and the idling of car engines. Also, large plots of precious land are being consumed in order to create the necessary road infrastructure that is deemed necessary. Personal consequences, Mr. Speaker, are seen to appear in the form of anxiety, physiological stress, sometimes referred to as road rage, heightened respiratory disease, and spine-related problems resulting from prolonged sitting in non-ergonomically designed seats. Vehicles, Mr. Speaker, themselves are not immune from the additional stress imparted to vehicles, such as wear and tear, not to mention the added cost of gasoline, and in some rare cases, but it does happen, vehicle accidents. Now, Mr. Speaker, infrastructure solutions attempted by the Cayman Islands over the years have included road widening, single and multi-lanes, new roads, new signaling systems, more parking lots, and yes, more roundabouts. Now, while necessary, this additional infrastructure comes at tremendous cost. Mr. Speaker, as Father of the House, I'm certain you will recall, as will many others, in 2007, when it was said that we in the Cayman Islands were on a road building rampage. And if I may validate that statement for a moment, I don't say that with any kind of criticism, Mr. Speaker, so please don't misunderstand. In 2007, this was a time when the East-West Arterial was being constructed, as was the Esterly-Tibbetts Highway undergoing a further extension. All of these works were necessary to deal with, at the time, the cries coming out of your district, Mr. Speaker, the District of West Bay, concerning the residents of that district and their daily horrific morning commute. In 2007, as a country, we were spending $26 million in road construction and a further $4.9 million in road maintenance for a total spend of nearly $31 million. By comparison, Mr. Speaker, 10 years later in 2017, we spent $5 million on new road construction and a whopping $9.9 million in road maintenance for a total spend of $15 million. In 2018, it witnessed a similar spend of $5.2 million in new road construction and a further $9.7 million in road maintenance. The reason, Mr. Speaker, as to why the amount budgeted for new road construction in 2017 and 2018 was much lower than in previous years and certainly in previous past decades, I believe comes on the account of the NRA agreement with DART, which saw a number of major highways built and extended through private sector partnership. Had the government, Mr. Speaker, assumed the responsibility of those costs, then the cost to the taxpayer would have been much higher than the $5 million and $5.2 million in 2017 and 2018. And I believe, though I stand to be corrected, that the value of roads built under the NRA agreement was in the region of between $16 and $20 million. And Mr. Speaker, whilst the average cost of building roads has remained somewhat steady over the past 10 years, and I think this is something that the government, respective governments, should be commended for when we consider that in other areas, prices, say for example, construction of, I don't know, schools, have increased over 10 years. The cost of building roads has largely remained unchanged. However, with that in mind, it is still costing this country on average $1,000 per linear foot or $3 million per mile of new road. The point, Mr. Speaker, that I wish to draw listeners' minds to is that transportation infrastructure comes at great cost. And given the current financial constraints and the financial position, rather, one is constrained to conclude that the Cayman Islands would find it virtually impossible to add, operate, and maintain these necessary infrastructure projects for a sustainable or a substantial, length of time. As witnessed by the numbers, for every new road that we build, we as a country increase the annual operating costs to maintain those roads. Because many of these infrastructures over time show signs of atrophy and therefore must be replaced, causing unsustainable future burdens on both present as well as future governments. Now, earlier, Mr. Speaker, I spoke about the side effects of Grand Cayman's great economic fortune, and that is as our population and household wealth have increased, so too have the number of vehicles registered in the Cayman Islands also increased. Mr. Speaker, according to statistics obtained from various government agencies, and I believe during Finance Committee we heard similar numbers given through witness testimony, there are presently 42,459 vehicles registered as roadworthy in the Cayman Islands. However, there is an additional 37,406 vehicles that are listed on the register as unlicensed and we assume not roadworthy and potentially even derelict, bringing the total number of vehicles on the official register to just under 80,000, or precisely 79,865 vehicles presently registered in the Cayman Islands. Now, let me state, Mr. Speaker, that initiatives already underway by the current coalition government of national unity, such as the new EVR, or electronic vehicle registration system, combined with the replating exercise and the much anticipated vehicle licensing amnesty, which I'm told, fingers crossed, will be implemented sometime this month, These exercises will better enable the government and various government agencies to more precisely determine that 37,000 number of cars, whether roadworthy, unroadworthy, or simply needing of a few repairs and can be placed back on the road. I think this is an important first step in the right direction, Mr. Speaker, and I applaud my unity government for their foresight. However, Mr. Speaker, for a population size of just over 63,415, according to the Economic and Statistics Office website, that works out to roughly 1.2 cars per person, or 1 car and 1 moped per person in the Cayman Islands. It is further estimated, Mr. Speaker, that if our population demographics continue to grow, we will see the level of traffic congestion increase by upwards of 200% over the next 5 years, unless we are prepared to take a long, hard look at what we can live with and what we can not live without. The stress and delays, and if we don't do this, the stress and delays caused by traffic congestion will not go away, but in fact will indeed get much, much worse. Now, that number of an increase of 200% in 5 years is an easy number to comprehend and accept, Mr. Speaker, when we consider the number of vehicles being imported on an annual basis. Again, according to statistics received from various government agencies, in 2014, 2,946 vehicles were imported for the year at an average rate of 246 vehicles per month. In 2017, that number increased by 66% to 4,897 vehicles imported for the year at an average rate of 408 vehicles per month. For 2018, Mr. Speaker, a further 4,783 vehicles were imported at an average rate of 398 vehicles per month. And whilst that number represents a small decrease, Mr. Speaker, of 2.3% compared to 2017, it still represents a 62% increase on vehicle imports in just 4 years. And as shocking, Mr. Speaker, as these numbers may be, these numbers merely account for the new and or used vehicles being imported into the Cayman Islands. It does not account for the cars that are, in fact, already here. For example, Mr. Speaker, for the month of April 2019, this month, 4,935 vehicle registrations will come due. Next month, May 2019, a further 4,288 registrations will come due. Mr. Speaker, for an 18-month period between January 2017 and August 2018, staff at the Department of Vehicle and Driver's Licensing processed 109,773 vehicle-related transactions. Now that works out on an average of just over 6,000 vehicle transactions per month. That's 6,045 transactions to be precise. What that tells me, Mr. Speaker, is that whilst the vehicles themselves represent a strain on the road infrastructure, requiring greater and greater investments in either new roads or road expansions, and further compounds the traffic congestion problem, this increased number of transactions highlights the human resource costs incurred by the government in terms of the manpower needed in order to support this vast number of vehicles. Unless we take action, Mr. Speaker, these costs to the Treasury, which I need not remind members is made possible by the taxpayers of this country, will only increase. Now, one way, Mr. Speaker, to deal with the growing manpower demand required to process this many vehicles annually would be to move more and more services to an online platform, whereby technology could do most of the heavy lifting, leaving only the need for specific administrative functions to be carried out by physical staff. Again, I would like to commend the Department of Vehicle and Driver's Licensing through the stellar leadership and vision of the Minister and Ministry of Commerce, Infrastructure and Planning for recently adding the vehicle registration renewal process to an online platform. I think, Mr. Speaker, this is a step in the right direction. Certainly, I took advantage of this new online application process simply because, like everyone else who has time to have lunch, let alone step out and license your car. But the process was seamless, easy, and something that I certainly look forward to doing again. I understand there will be more and more services added to the online platform, which again will further simplify some of the existing processes. And again, I thank the Honourable Minister responsible. However, Mr. Speaker, perhaps more troubling than the number of cars or vehicles that we import on an annual basis is the number of derelict or being recorded as received cars coming into the landfill. As I mentioned, Mr. Speaker, whilst today we are importing vehicles at an average rate of 398 vehicles per month, we are only disposing of an average of 30 vehicles per month into the Georgetown landfill. The remainder, I believe, Mr. Speaker, can be found on the roadsides of our once beautiful communities, gathering like dust in the form of derelict vehicles, which are not only unsightly, but represent a significant health risk, both in terms of vermin, as well as potential breeding grounds for mosquitoes during the rainy season. Whilst I would like to recognize and thank, in particular, the Department of Environmental Health, who have been extremely responsive to calls, certainly from my constituency of Prospect, but I also know, and I think I saw a recent social media post whereby they identified some, I think the number was 83 vehicles being removed, derelict vehicles being removed since the beginning of the year. So whilst we congratulate and thank the DEH for providing a valuable service, it is clear that something more substantial needs to be done and needs to be done urgently, Mr. Speaker. So what is the solution? How do we improve our traffic congestion problem so it doesn't take a resident of the Eastern District's 45 minutes to an hour to get into town, or to get many residents even out of their driveways, let alone fighting the traffic of the main highway, as is the case almost daily for my constituents in Prospect? Personally, Mr. Speaker, I do not believe the problem will be solved by any single element, but instead with a combination of many improvements working in concert towards the ultimate goal, which is producing viable outcomes that, when combined, improve the flow of traffic, reduce congestion, and in the long term, reduce the costs and undue pressure placed on our limited infrastructure. That is why, Mr. Speaker, this motion calls on the government to consider examining and make recommendations on the most suitable standards for the importation of vehicles, such as by age limits, classification, or by fuel type. This, Mr. Speaker, I believe can be achieved by commissioning a select committee to examine possible standards that may be introduced as a matter of urgency. This will include, Mr. Speaker, engaging stakeholders, automotive dealers, used car dealers, auto mechanics, as well as the general public through a commonly known theory of crowdsourcing, which through their combined intelligence, Mr. Speaker, I believe will be able to make recommendations that may be presented to the government by the end of this fiscal year, with recommendations to be implemented as early as 2020. Mr. Speaker, this select committee would be charged with the responsibility of setting appropriate standards that would lead to alleviating traffic congestion through the development and implementation of careful strategies that would serve in the national interest. Of these strategies, or careful strategies, Mr. Speaker, in my opinion, there are two routes in which we can take. In the first instance, Mr. Speaker, it may be desirable to look at the least cost or non-infrastructure related solutions to mounting traffic. These are inexpensive propositions and are not very difficult to implement. And primarily, and perhaps more importantly, they require the citizens and the city decision makers to sit together to work out the solutions. On more complex matters, whereby importation policy, for example, Mr. Speaker, may need to be revisited, may require more careful consideration, and in my opinion, would require broad stakeholder engagement and public consultation. That is why, Mr. Speaker, this motion does not seek to pin the government down to one or two proposed solutions, but instead proposes a comprehensive plan of action that is not only sustainable, Mr. Speaker, but one that will enjoy long-term success. And if we can achieve this together, then I believe we all will have truly done a service to the people we have the pleasure of representing. Mr. Speaker, the Premier often reminds me and his caucus that politics is the art of the possible. As such, let us examine and discuss just what may indeed be possible. As I stated, Mr. Speaker, some of these solutions are what I would call low-hanging fruit, or concepts that are easy to implement, that carry the least infrastructure cost, while others may require more careful consideration. First, Mr. Speaker, let us examine those low-hanging fruit, which may be implemented immediately, requiring not government, but instead the combined will of the people, perhaps with some government support. Things like carpooling, Mr. Speaker. Like most of the members in this House, I have to contend with traffic every single day. More so when I take my son to school, who has to arrive before 8 o'clock. And whilst in traffic, it is hard not to notice that most vehicles, whether big or small, are carrying, on average, 1 to 2 people. Incentives, Mr. Speaker, may be offered, such as reduced licensing fees for vehicles that participate in carpooling as a means of encouraging citizens, residents, communities, those who live on the same street, those who go to the same school, to perhaps participate in a carpooling exercise where they vary who the driver or the designated driver may be for this week, this day, or otherwise. Another relatively low-cost solution, Mr. Speaker, that may cause some inconvenience, but it is an inconvenience that I believe can be shared and a solution to it found, is the introduction of staggered hours or flex time. Now, this is an idea that I openly admit is not exclusively mine. Most of these ideas are not exclusively mine, but they are sensible recommendations that are worthy of some further examination. Mr. Speaker, peak traffic is a phenomenon that happens because organizations, offices, and schools have more or less the same operating hours. That is why morning and evening traffic are the worst possible times to be in your vehicle. It is possible that citizens and city decision makers could in fact sit together and agree on the staggering of operating hours. For example, Mr. Speaker, companies with 50 or more employees should be required to divide their workday into 2 different periods. Since there are night owls and early birds by human nature, we could divide the workforce in half and make one shift period starting between 5 and 8 a.m., ending at 1 to 3 p.m. And the second shift for the night owls could begin between 10 a.m. and 1 p.m. and ending between 6 p.m. and 9 p.m. Mr. Speaker, if embraced, this would instantly halve the amount of traffic at any given time on the road, effectively doubling the road capacity without a single new road construction project. Now, Mr. Speaker, if memory serves me correct, the Chamber of Commerce in 2015 embraced this concept and urged their members to adopt it, though I'm not certain if it generated any sort of sustainable steam, but I think if we need only look at the traffic congestion that exists today to see that it didn't. Another tangible and low-cost solution, Mr. Speaker, can be found through optimized traffic light management. Urban Traffic Management Control Systems, or UTMC, can be very effective, Mr. Speaker, at maximizing road capacity by varying the timing of traffic lights to match demand in real time. When all lights are coordinated responsively to demand, incidents of vehicles stuck at junctions leading to gridlock can be minimized. Traffic planners can also prepare and model programs to cope with specific scenarios, such as incidents of an arterial road exiting onto or off of a roundabout. Again, sticking to what I know, we can look at the Tomlinson roundabout as an example, or of course the Hurley's roundabout as another example. The good news, Mr. Speaker, is that these traffic modeling systems, thanks to the commitment and investment of previous administrations, are in fact available to the NRA and are indeed used almost on a daily basis. Another straightforward solution, Mr. Speaker, enforce existing road traffic laws. Things like illegal parking, waiting, loading and unloading, and a poor understanding of the road law, and in particular, how to maneuver roundabouts despite the high number that we do have, all obstruct the flow of traffic, reduces capacity at junctions, holds traffic up, and increases the danger for those walking or cycling. Driving at an inappropriate speed, driving on road mediums, or driving through restricted areas all contribute to the gridlock and could possibly lead to fatalities on the extreme end, or certainly injuries, and an unwillingness for people to walk or cycle, or to allow their children to walk or cycle unaccompanied. Improving ticketing, Mr. Speaker, for such offenses can be used to offset the costs associated with road infrastructure, or may be used to supplement the need for increased police presence along our roadways. The challenge will be for the government, Mr. Speaker, and local authorities to sell enforcement as a positive effort to help responsible road users rather than a war on motorists. Another low-hanging fruit example, rationalized distribution and deliveries. Now let me break that down to the layman. Households, Mr. Speaker, need to buy goods. Let's pick an example, groceries. An agreement could be reached among businesses whereby goods are increasingly delivered through home delivery services. This could be organized in such a manner that both individual trips and delivery trips are minimized by rationalizing distribution and deliveries by use of consolidation and redistribution depots. The immediate and most glaring gains are the reduced individual car trips replaced by increased delivery van trips. In some cases, Mr. Speaker, and I've seen this is already happening, but I believe if fully embraced, not only would we reduce the traffic congestion problem, but in doing so, we would create new job and entrepreneurial opportunities for Caymanian ownership. Lastly on the list, but certainly not last in the list of what could be possible solutions, and I'm sure we will hear maybe in a few more added to this, improved cycling infrastructure. Build it and they will come is as true to cycling paths as it is to roads. As long as they provide, Mr. Speaker, a continuous connection between places that people want to travel between without dangerous junctions or road crossings. We can build protected cycling lanes, with as much possible separation between busy roads and, where possible, pedestrians. We can design segregated crossings at busy junctions where potential conflicts between cars, cycles, and pedestrians could be reduced to a minimum. And certainly we would seek to remove physical obstacles, especially if they require people to dismount. Now, I will admit that perhaps improved cycling infrastructure, Mr. Speaker, would fall into the medium capital infrastructure category and perhaps may better be served as part of a wider national road infrastructure plan. But what cannot be denied is the relationship between traffic flow and delay means that a relatively small reduction, 10, 15%, which may be achieved by one or a combination thereof of these previously identified solutions, can in fact result in large reductions in overall congestion further down the line. So these, Mr. Speaker, are what I define as the possible low-hanging fruit, or what may otherwise be described as social inputs to alleviate traffic congestion that can be implemented quickly, are not dependent on the government, but returns the solutions into the hands of the citizens. Now we come to the more complex and somewhat controversial traffic management matters. It has been suggested, certainly on the talk shows, Mr. Speaker, that persons on work permits should not own cars, but instead use public transportation. The argument has been supported by the fact that many of our immigrant population never actually owned a car in their home jurisdiction and are therefore adding to the congestion by being able to own cars in the Cayman Islands. Let me admit that such an approach, in my opinion, is draconian, and I'm not a big fan. However, because I do not hold the patent on good ideas, I am willing to add it to the conversation table in the Select Committee and allow stakeholders, public consultation, to decide. Instead, Mr. Speaker, I propose, as set out in my motion, setting standards versus restricting any one person, foreign or local, from enjoying any form of personal freedoms. Why do I oppose it? Well, the first question one must ask when endeavoring down this path is, who decides? Who gets and who doesn't? And from my short time as a representative, I see this as not representing a good proposition for the government, because inevitably somebody loses, somebody is disadvantaged. And such an approach, again, may very well run contrary to the principles of good governance. Also, in order to make this argument work, you must first have a dependable public transport system. And despite our best efforts to date, we cannot say that we have achieved this. Certainly not in mass transit, anyway. However, Mr. Speaker, once again, I am confident that the Minister of Commerce, Planning and Infrastructure has this matter of public transportation on his radar and is working in conjunction with the qualified professionals, such as Mr. Colin Lumsden, who was appointed town manager for our capital district of Georgetown, who himself is a qualified architect, formerly with the Public Works Department. And I believe the question of dependable public transport is being looked at, and I think the public can be assured that improvements are on the way. I certainly recall the Leader of the Opposition just in this sitting making a recommendation along the same lines as his proposal to improve public transportation. So what, Mr. Speaker, standards should we be putting in place? Well, Mr. Speaker, my motion recommends setting standards such as by age limits, classification, and/or by fuel type. I will admit, Mr. Speaker, that these standards were neither pulled out of thin air, nor, again, as I stated earlier, are they exclusively my ideas, but instead represent possible considerations that can be made in the Cayman Islands as they have been adopted by other islands in our region. For example, Mr. Speaker, restrictions on the age limit of cars imported is commonplace in jurisdictions like Trinidad and Tobago, Jamaica, the Bahamas, and I think we're all familiar with the Bermuda model. In Trinidad and Tobago, Mr. Speaker, cars must not be older than 4 years old to be imported, while in Jamaica, the age limit for both cars and trucks is 5 years old. In the Bahamas, whilst there is no age limit for the importation of vehicles, they get around this deterrent factor by increasing the costs of import duty on the value of vehicles. For example, Mr. Speaker, vehicles that cost less than $10,000 to be imported into the Bahamas attracts an import duty of 45%, the value of the car. Meanwhile, vehicles that cost between $10,000 and $20,000 attracts an import duty of 50%, the value of the car. And vehicles that cost between $20,000 and $25,000 attracts an import duty of 65%, and above that, any vehicle costing more than $25,000 attracts an import duty of a whopping 75%, the value of that car. So I believe by virtue of hitting them where it counts, certainly the Bahamas has achieved a reduction in their importation, though I do not have those figures to be able to validate that point. In Bermuda, Mr. Speaker, things are much more restrictive and comes on the heels of a report conducted by or on behalf of the Bermuda Transport Department. The report indicated that if Bermuda had more than 15,000 cars on its total area of 21 square miles or 37 miles of public road, then it would have reached saturation point. Would it surprise you if I told you that according to 2015 figures, 48,971 vehicles are registered in Bermuda? That works out to approximately 2,300 vehicles per square mile. Clearly, they have reached saturation point and are well beyond it and have a rather significant problem. Also, according to global statistics, Bermuda has more vehicle accidents per square mile than any other place in the world. Things are so bad in Bermuda that right now there are over 120 different proposals that are still being considered and include limiting car ownership altogether. This suggests to me, Mr. Speaker, once again, that there is, or there may not be, any one magic silver bullet solution, but instead a combination of many potential solutions in order to find the answer. But what it also highlights to me, Mr. Speaker, is what Bermuda's landmass size of Cayman Brac with a population of the Cayman Islands. If you think it can't happen to us, wait. Do nothing, and we will find ourselves in a similar position in no time at all. In terms of import standards, Mr. Speaker, only new cars, or those less than 6 months old, presently can be imported into Bermuda. What these examples represent, Mr. Speaker, as I stated at the beginning, all developed countries have a traffic congestion problem. And all countries, particularly those smaller nations in the Caribbean, are now forced to consider implementing standards that can stem the tide of congestion. Perhaps the Cayman Islands might consider restricting vehicles to 10 years old or less from being imported. I don't know. But this is what I propose as the need for having a conversation with our people to discuss. And I believe this conversation is long overdue. Another way we in the Cayman Islands may consider in terms of imported vehicles is by classification. And by that, I mean by improved emission standards. Why are emissions important? Why should we even consider it? Well, several studies, including that of the European Fuel Oxygenate Association, confirm the impact of car emissions on human health and on the environment. According to the report, long-term exposure in humans over 30 years is known to cause premature death due to respiratory-related problems. Pollution from cars is considered the leading cause of bronchitis and asthma in both adults and children. Low molecular weight compounds are irritants and can reduce drowsiness and other complications, whilst higher molecular weight compounds are suspected as being mutanogens or carcinogens. In other words, congestion and breathing vehicle emissions can actually cause cancer, as if we in the Cayman Islands need any more reasons to cause cancer. By introducing, Mr. Speaker, better emission standards, not only can we protect the environment and the public health, but also better emissions also means saving consumers money at the pumps. According to the Environmental Protection Agency, clean car initiatives such as stricter emission standards not only cuts harmful climate pollution, but will also nearly double our current fuel economy performance by 2025. Now, who would like to make less trips to the pumps and stay in their car and get greater gas mileage? I certainly would be. Finally, Mr. Speaker, consideration may be given to restrictions on imported vehicles based on fuel type. And by that, I refer to the pros and cons of high octane versus ultra high sulfur diesel versus hybrids, which are a combination of both electric and a combustion engine. Or we can move towards fully embracing electric vehicles. February 21st of this year, Mr. Speaker, marked the second anniversary of Cabinet's acceptance and approval of the National Energy Policy, which articulates government's commitment to reducing the island's heavy fossil fuel consumption in transportation. I am again proud of the efforts of this coalition government of national unity for moving this agenda forward by way of recent cabinet approvals for the removal and/or reduction in duty for electric vehicles, which will signal to the market that electric vehicles are worth the investment, and moreover, dealers can now commit to the resources and skills necessary, not just to sell these vehicles, Mr. Speaker, but also to service these vehicles once there is potential for substantial growth in electric vehicle purchases. This is your unit of government stimulating your local economy, Mr. Speaker, and in the process working towards what could be a reduction, certainly in the pollutants caused by heavy traffic across all three islands. Adding the electric vehicle sector to our conversation of setting standards to improve traffic congestion by looking at fuel types would only further elevate the understanding and value of reducing our dependence on fossil fuels, Mr. Speaker, and in so doing, support the spirit upon which the national energy policy was intended. It is for these reasons, Mr. Speaker, that I believe the time has come to elevate the question of traffic congestion to a much wider national discussion. And I believe the starting point for this national discussion to begin can be found in the recommendation of my motion. The reality is that government must contend with is that as more and more households grow, as our population expands, as our personal wealth expands, we can expect that more and more cars, whether new or used, will be imported into the Cayman Islands. So how then do we plan on dealing with what has been identified as inevitable? How can we balance the freedom of owning a car with the need to protect the natural environment? How can we better manage the derelict vehicles scattered across the islands with minimal strain on financial resources of central government? How can we ensure our road infrastructure continues to meet population demands while reducing congestion? Mr. Speaker, there are plenty of unexplored options, tough arguments, and downright simple solutions that we can begin to undertake. Let's see what can be done practically and resolutely to fix this explosive challenge by putting our heads together, Mr. Speaker, and coming up with a plan that will benefit our people, not only by reducing congestion, but also by improving lives. Again, I quote the Premier, "Politics is the art of the possible." So I ask honorable members to let's think about what is possible, and I ask members to put their support behind this motion. I thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Does any other member wish to speak? Does any other member for Georgetown Central?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to give a few contributions to the motion brought by the member for Prospect. I do intend to be too long, Mr. Speaker, as I think that the member from Prospect did an excellent job in covering much of what the discussion could potentially be about, but recognizing that there is a lot of room to grow, but also recognizing that he doesn't have all the solutions, but his motion sparks the ignition of the best solution to be found with this problem that we all accept to be concerning. Mr. Speaker, I want to congratulate the member for his well thought out, researched, and logical thoughts about this matter. You can tell that it's something that it mattered a lot to him, and a lot of positions were put forward and considerations as a starting point when I believe that this motion is passed, based on its merits he's presented, that a select group of individuals can find the solutions, particularly when it comes to importation of vehicles and potentially also affect the traffic woes that we have. So, Mr. Speaker, throughout his debate, I only took some notes of things that I think the mover of the motion may want to consider as things that came to my mind that may want to be taken into consider. But being mindful that at this stage we're asking for the creation of a select committee to consider these things as well. And Mr. Speaker, the mover had suggested some of the ways upon which we can potentially solve the growing problem of traffic and imports. And I just want, once this motion is successful, that we consider the Caymanians involved in this element and that they are not adversely affected in any way, particularly when it comes to cost. The first thing that comes to my mind with some of the solutions that some of the suggested solutions I've heard publicly, as well as what the member from Prospect had examined, were things that could potentially affect those of lower income. Some of those concerns was increasing the cost of vehicles that are older. Mr. Speaker, for those who don't have a lot of income are already facing the high cost of living in the Cayman Islands, and that would be another increased cost. It is a way to slow down the increase in numbers on the road, because the more expensive it is, the less chance of persons wanting to go purchase that service of having a vehicle. But, Mr. Speaker, I think it's important that we re-examine the other option that he suggested, or he examined within his motion. Not agreeing to it, but examining it for the listening audience to see the thought process that he examined so many different scenarios, and that this select committee can examine them as well. But the fact that he said he's not in support of taking anyone's right to freedom of purchasing a vehicle, which has been suggested on many of the local radio shows of expats not having cars. But, Mr. Speaker, I would be more in favor of that than another solution that is going to cost Caymanians fees to have a vehicle to go up. Because, Mr. Speaker, I think the government has done as much as they can to keep up with the growing demands in respect to road infrastructure, but sometimes we don't realize that the population is growing faster than we can fix the roads. So it seems like nothing is being done. And as a result, it could potentially harm those of the land, meaning the Caymanians, if we make changes that potentially will affect everyone. So if there has to be any measure of increase in cost, I think we should consider increase in costs for non-Caymanians. But I accept also, Mr. Speaker, that the member highlighted the fact that these potential changes that the select committee will have to examine has to be also examined with and in tandem with a proper transport system, one of which I understand the Minister for Transport is definitely, the Minister for Roads is definitely considering and examining in respect to the current improvements in the roads in the Cayman Islands. We've heard from the Minister talk about re-examining the transport system to see ways of improvement. So the mover of this motion is correct This cannot happen in isolation, and there's no one change that's going to solve the problem. And his hope to have this select committee to examine all moving parts together to potentially find a solution. Mr. Speaker, the mover of the motion also went into an area of concern about derelict vehicles. And I would like to take the opportunity to use this discussion, though it's a positive one, to talk about some things I think the government should consider in respect to helping with the derelict vehicle issue. I'm not sure, Mr. Speaker, if the government has considered charging individuals who leave their vehicles derelict. I think, Mr. Speaker, at this particular moment, the consideration is that there is a fee collected at the start of the importation of the vehicle, and therefore it is perceived that the government has already collected its fees. But, Mr. Speaker, to my understanding, that fee is to take that vehicle from the dump off the island, not from your area of your community to the dump. So, Mr. Speaker, if someone is not responsible enough to get the vehicle to the dump, in whichever means, whether you tow it yourself or you pay a tow truck company to do so, and you leave it to the hands of the government to do the job of keeping this island clean, you should be penalized for it. And I say penalized not in a way of other than a fee. It should be embarrassing for any one person to know that their vehicle had to be moved. So, Mr. Speaker, I ask the mover of this motion, if and when it's successful, that whichever select committee is formed, that they consider those concerns. Mr. Speaker, some of the things I was hoping to hear, also what is the government's rate of exportation of vehicles once they have been sent to the dump? Because at the rate of 398 cars per month on average, Mr. Speaker, I think it's important that we have the number per month exporting from this country to be almost the same, because the cost that the mover of this motion highlighted in many other forms can also be added to the cost of our dump and having them stored at that location. One which that I think that we all as members of this government want to find the best solution for our landfill. Mr. Speaker, the mover of the motion talked about incentives that the Chamber of Commerce had suggested in staggered hours. Another great solution that the member highlighted and showed his commitment to the proper research and discussion to this motion. And Mr. Speaker, I agree with him that that is something that can be re-examined as a solution to the traffic woes in the Cayman Islands. But, Mr. Speaker, I think the reason why it was not as successful as it had hoped to be was because business persons weren't given incentives to have staggered hours. Mr. Speaker, you see, when you ask major companies who have many employees to have staggered hours, Mr. Speaker, that is also a cost to those companies. And unless you're willing to compensate those companies, it is difficult for us as a government to ask them to incur any more costs than they already do. So in order for that staggered hour approach to work, Mr. Speaker, I think the government has to reach out with an olive branch or offer a carrot approach in respect to that in order for them to buy in. Whether that may mean reduce fees, whether it be licensing fees, work permit fees, or whichever way the government finds it to do so, but you have to give them encouragement to be involved in that kind of idea. So for the select committee in the future, it's something that we should all examine. Mr. Speaker, the member who moved this motion also spoke about the incurring cost of the large number of imports and vehicles. But I think it's also fair to recognize that with the large number of cars that are being brought in, the government is also collecting a large number of income by way of duties, by way of licensing, and by way of inspections. So, Mr. Speaker, it's for us as a country to properly manage that income to help with this solution, because we collect those fees for a reason. For every car, for every inspection, for every license, for the government to find those solutions. So if we're going to say that the numbers are increasing, we also have to say the income from that increase is also increasing. So basically, Mr. Speaker, it's difficult to say that only the cost is going up, because the income is also going up. But we have to manage those monies that we collect in respect to the increase. Mr. Speaker, I want to say that I'm grateful that the member brought this motion. I think the member has done a lot of research and thought into this discussion. He presented a very comprehensive presentation of much of the area of concern, and will make it easy for the committee to get started if they take the opportunity to hear the discussion. Mr. Speaker, I think it's important that I make a declaration at this point in respect to this motion that I myself am now involved in a vehicle-related business. So, beg your indulgence, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to make a declaration of personal interest, not that I think it would affect this motion in any capacity, but I have recently been involved in a business to do with vehicles. That being said, Mr. Speaker, I encourage this Honorable House to support the motion, and I look forward to hearing back from the Select Committee if this motion, and when this motion is passed, to potentially being a key part to finding the solution to the lost hours within traffic that we travel every day as Caymanians, because those hours could definitely be used for something more valuable, like time with your family and in your community. With that being said, Mr. Speaker, I give full support to this motion, and that's my contribution.
The member for Georgetown South. Do you suspect you will be long?
Very brief, Mr. Speaker.
As usual, yes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to make a brief contribution to private members' motion number 14 of 2018-2019, brought by the member for Prospect and seconded by the member for Georgetown West. It seeks to set standards for the importation of vehicles, which is something that needs to be dealt with as a matter of urgency. The situation on our roads has now reached almost total gridlock. This is particularly evident for motorists coming into and leaving the capital during rush hour in the morning and evening, primarily from the eastern districts. With the unrestricted importation of vehicles, principally from Japan, by all and sundry, our roads have now exceeded capacity to the extent where it takes over an hour to travel a distance that previously would take approximately 15 minutes. Mr. Speaker, I can attest to this as my daughter lives in the Newlands area, and trust me, I can look out for her call every morning and hear the frustration in her voice as she bitterly complains of how long it takes her to get to her workplace. She generally leaves home around 6:30 a.m., sometimes earlier, and she doesn't arrive to work until 7:30 a.m. most mornings. And Mr. Speaker, I also have a number of WhatsApp chats, and I can look out for the constant messages each morning from friends heading to work from the eastern districts. Mr. Speaker, this situation has resulted in considerable frustration and road rage, not to mention the loss of productivity in the workplace, impacting the business community and government. Our roads are not capable of accommodating any more vehicles, and action must be taken, like I said before, as a matter of urgency. There is also the health aspect to factor in, with motorists having to sit for extended periods on congested roadways, inhaling the exhaust fumes from idling engines. Of particular concern are emissions of nitrogen dioxide from diesel vehicles. This situation is not just related to the Cayman Islands. Many other countries have had to introduce stringent measures in order to combat congestion. We do not have to reinvent the wheel in addressing congestion on our roads. There are a number of models which have been introduced in other jurisdictions that have worked and continue to work. Foremost amongst these models is the Singapore model, which could be adapted to address our situation. Understanding the economic issues that come with traffic congestion, the government of Singapore put in place a range of incentives and constraints to limit the impact of cars have on state. There's a system of quotas, registration fees, and congestion charges that allow Singapore's traffic to flow relatively easy 24/7. Therefore, Mr. Speaker, I would recommend to the member for Prospect that the committee that he is suggesting be set up, that in their research, they review the Singapore model. Mr. Speaker, I think all members in this honorable House will support this motion, as traffic congestion is affecting all of us. But more importantly, those members who live on the eastern side of the island, their families and their constituents who have to contend with this traffic issue at least 5 days a week, if not more. Mr. Speaker, we are continually playing catch-up with this aspect of our infrastructure, our roads. Building more roads Adding new lanes and roundabouts is not the solution if we do not limit the number of cars on our roads. Online purchasing of vehicles has a major impact on the various dealerships which have invested heavily in their businesses. When a work permit holder can import 20 cars a year without a trade and business license, we know that vehicle importation is totally out of control. Another area of concern is that of tourism, Mr. Speaker. We are continually spending vast sums of money promoting our islands, yet the experience our visitors are having is far from satisfactory. When it takes longer to get to their hotel or condo than it takes to fly here, we have a problem. We must ensure that this aspect of our economy does not deteriorate due to inactivity in not addressing this serious situation. There's another contribution to congestion, which is that of public buses. Mr. Speaker, there needs to be more designated bus stops throughout the districts. The Rotary Club Central sponsors the bus shelter program, and I want to publicly thank them for their efforts in this valuable contribution to the community. But they need more support from the public through advertising to enable them to generate more revenue to install more of these bus shelters. We also need the bus drivers to be more disciplined in how they collect and drop off passengers. It is extremely frustrating having public buses stopping all along the streets, picking up and dropping off passengers instead of adhering to the designated bus stops. It is not only contributing to congestion, but it is also totally unsafe. Speaking of public buses, we need to seriously consider introducing a more regulated public transport system, which will aid in eliminating the number of cars on our roads, and in so doing, easing congestion. Incentives must be available to operators in order to improve public transport, making it an alternative to owning a vehicle. Mr. Speaker, I want to commend my colleague and the member for Prospect for bringing this very important motion, which is very timely and of great significance to every single individual that live and work in these islands. Therefore, Mr. Speaker, I wish to state that I fully support this motion. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Does any other member wish to speak? The member for Georgetown. At this point, since several members are indicating to speak, I will have to take a suspension. We shall suspend for 45 minutes. Oh God, I was hoping so, but don't look so. Yes.